Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me enormous pleasure to be here to present this talk for the third time here at Webb. And I must admit, each time I come here, I'm just spellbound about what happens here and all the opportunities that you, the students, have by coming to such an esteemed place as Webb. And certainly my time on the board, I thoroughly enjoyed that period. And I like to think that by giving these lectures and showing you what I've done, it's my way of putting something back for you. Now, this is a very personal story. It's how I moved through my career and became naval architect and designed Queen Mary 2. And it's also going to give some lessons. And I hope I'm going to pose some questions that I'm going to ask you to think about what you're going to do, your future. And there may be a little controversial bit as well. We'll see how we get on. So, without further ado, we'll begin. So on a cold September night, passengers standing on a ship crossing the North Atlantic, just after midnight, in one cold September, passengers looked out across the horizon and they saw a solitary red dot. And initially they thought the red dot was the planet Mars or some other heavenly body. But as they focused their attention on the dot, they realized that it was in fact another ship, but a ship on a parallel and opposite course to their own. And within a few minutes, the red dot had morphed into a ship with two red and black funnels. And they looked over their shoulder at the ship they were on, and they could see that their ship had three red and black funnels that were similarly brightly illuminated. And that event in mid-Atlantic, September the 25th, 1967, was the last time that the venerable Cunard Queens crossed in mid-Atlantic. And everybody, including Cunard, said that that was the beginning of the end of the transatlantic service and route. The three-funneled ship, the Queen Mary, had already been sold to the city of Long Beach, and she went there towards the end of October 1967, where she still remains. Queen Elizabeth, the two-funneled ship, soldiered on for one more year before she too was sold, initially to be an attraction in Philadelphia, but she was moved down to Florida, and that wasn't a success, and she was sold again, this time to become a floating university. And we'll see a little bit about her history in a minute. But sowing the seeds of a lifetime passion, what actually caused me to be interested in naval architecture? Why did I have a burning ambition to build something like Queen Mary 2? Well, it began with a British television programme, which is the longest running children's programme in the world, called Blue Peter. And it's broadcast twice a week for an hour, 5 o'clock. In my time, it was on Monday and Thursdays. And the presenters used to go out, find interesting things that they thought would be interest to youngsters, and then they would do a program about it. You must remember, it's the days before internet. Shock horror. Can you imagine what it must have been like without internet? Well, as youngsters, we took most of the information that we needed when growing up from Blue Peter. It was a national institution in the UK, and believe me, most youngsters really, really revered the programme and everything that was said. So in the presenters of Blue Peter went on the Queen Elizabeth, and I watched this as a young kid coming home from school. We only had grainy black and white television in those days. But going on the Queen Elizabeth, up to the bridge, the engine room, cabins, seeing the ship, I knew then that when I grew up, I wanted to design something bigger and better. And we don't, or didn't have the phrase that I'm going to use now, but it'd probably be more familiar to your generation. But when I give this lecture to schools and the like, try and encourage youngsters into thinking about their future, I now use the word cool, because we never used the word cool in my day, but certainly if I was giving this lecture to youngsters, I would say it must be cool to design something bigger and better than Queen Elizabeth. And in fact, the date of that television programme was the 24th of May 1965. So I was 5 years old when I watched that programme. Tremendous influence on me. This is the Queen Elizabeth, the ship that the Blue Peter went on. And as I say, she was taken out of service 1 year after that final dual crossing. And those two ships were replaced by one final queen, which everybody said would be the last transatlantic liner. And that was the Queen Elizabeth II, entered service in May 1969. And as a family, we were on holiday at the seaside resort of Bournemouth, which is very close to Southampton. And there was a coach trip to Southampton docks, and we were allowed to go on board QE2. And that is a picture of me there standing with my mother and two of my younger brothers. And of course, going on board QE2 when she was just 1 month old only galvanised my interest even more. And I must say as well, as we were standing in that exact spot below the mast of QE2, the United States was sailing in on one of her last trips across the Atlantic. And of course, I'm immensely sad that you over here have not been able to save the United States, and that she's finally, after many years of layup, going to be made into a reef down in Florida. Absolute shame that that ship couldn't be saved, and something. It's your ship of state after all, but that's another story. So a few years later, again coming home from school, switching on our black and white television, Blue Peter suddenly stopped their programme, and there was the first ever satellite link for the programme to Hong Kong Harbour. And there in the harbour was our old friend, the Queen Elizabeth, on fire and sinking. What happened, that a Hong Kong Chinese businessman, C.Y. Tung, had bought the ship and was converting it into a university, but nationalist Chinese didn't agree with some of the things he was doing, and so they stormed on board, managed to set fires along the length, and the ship was a complete and utter loss. Now, every year Blue Peter produced a Christmas annual, and the 1972 annual, which I received as a Christmas present from my family, had an article all about the Queen Elizabeth. Nice cross-section, some profiles giving the relative sizes of the different ships, and of course a lively narrative about the history of the Queen Elizabeth. But it was the last paragraph that really caught my attention. And it says, "It was a sad moment for everybody who loves great ships. The Queen Elizabeth was the last of a great age, a superliner, and nothing like her will ever be built again." So as a 12-year-old, having from the age of 5 said that I was going to do that, suddenly Blue Peter, that was this respected and revered program that we all looked up to, was suddenly telling me that I wouldn't be able to achieve that. And when I give the talk to young people, your young people as well, I always say that you have to take knocks throughout your career. You're going to be knocked off course, and it's your personality, your determination that is going to bring you back and get what you want. And that is the most important thing. So 12-year-old, but I was lucky because we were just learning how to write letters shortly after that in 1973. And my English teacher, who I'm still in touch with from all those years ago, she said the most important letter that you can learn to write is a letter of complaint. Because if you can effectively complain, you will invariably get what you want. So I wrote my letter about Blue Peter saying there's never going to be another liner again. But of course, whereas the rest of the class just kept their homework in their desk, I sent my letter off to Blue Peter. Now, Blue Peter gives out badges. And basically, if you just write into the program and they're interested in what you say, they'll give you a Blue Peter badge. If you do something a little bit more special, you'll get a silver one. If you do something extraordinary, you'll get a gold one. And of course, as a precocious 12-year-old, having written to Blue Peter saying, this is what I'm going to put on my liner, and I expected to get a gold badge. Well, of course, the inevitable happened, and I got the blue one. So another great disappointment that I had to get over. So I went to a school in southeast London, Catford Boys' School. And throughout that schooling, that was from 11 years up to 18, I kept telling everybody when I left school I wanted to become a naval architect. But the careers advice people that we were dependent on, they took me in hand and they said, look, don't do naval architecture. You'll never earn much money from that, and in any case, engineering in the UK is finished. You enjoy doing chemistry, you're good at chemistry, become an industrial chemist and earn much more money from that than you would have done if you become a naval architect. They were probably true there, but there you go. So, because nobody from my family had ever been to university before, and I was totally dependent on the advice of the school and the career service. So I went to Imperial College where I started studying chemistry. And 1 year into that degree, I met my physics master, Justin Johnson, who said that he had been prevented from advising me because the careers people said it was their responsibility. And he said, look, you should have gone and done your naval architecture. It's what you really wanted to do. And so with his help, and it was a tremendous amount of help was needed, he managed to get me an extra year's grant, which was the way university schooling was done in the day, and I was able to transfer to the University of Southampton, and there I got my degree in naval architecture, and shortly after began working for Carnival. So that's my side of the story. So let's look at Queen Mary II. Well, the big drive for Queen Mary II can be traced, in fact, back to Titanic. And the interest in Titanic began again when Robert Ballard found her on the seabed in 1985. But of course, it was James Cameron's film in 1997 that really galvanized public opinion and interest in Titanic. And at that time, 1997, Cunard, which was the only company then operating an express liner on the Atlantic, they were in rather dire trouble because their parent company had been sold to an Anglo-Norwegian company called Governa, and Governa weren't interested in Cunard. All they wanted was Trafalgar House's construction business. And so Cunard was left with underinvestment, nothing very much happening to it. But it was with the film Titanic that suddenly bookings surged on the QE2. And you know the reason why? Everybody wanted to go on QE2 and do this, which I don't recommend on a ship because people have fallen overboard. So that caused, in 1998, Carnival to actually acquire Cunard from the Caverna group. And then there was a study which I was put in charge of called Project Queen Mary. Basically, could we design and build a new transatlantic liner within a budget of $1 billion US? Would a new liner be able to give the return on investment where Carnival wanted a return within 10 years? And certainly my bosses, Mickey Harrison and Howard Frank, made it very clear that if this new ship performed less than some of the cruise ships, then they would abandon transatlantic and just build cruise ships. So the first question for all of you here, how would you react if your employer offered you $1 billion and asked you to define and design your dream project? What would you all do? I was 38 at the time I was given that challenge. Now, to understand the complexity of that challenge, we must understand the difference between a liner and a cruise ship. And you're all students of naval architecture, so you should know this. And some of it here is a bit simplified for passengers on the ship, so forgive me if some of these explanations seem a bit woolly, but it's mostly for people who are not engineering background. But you have a deep draft, you have a modest block coefficient, which is good for seakeeping, and certainly on the transatlantic we've just done, we had force 10 with 7-meter high seas at one stage, but the ship was able to maintain speed. A pyramid shape where the weight is concentrated in the middle, where it means that with the pyramid and the buoyancy in the middle, you're not going to overstress and form cracking. Enhanced strength and endurance, and enhanced speed potential, more margins that you need. A correlation factor for a cruise ship from going from a tank test maybe 15% additional power, but for this transatlantic liner you need 25 to 30%. And you need more public spaces because a lot of the time crossing the Atlantic there's fog or it's so stormy everybody has to stay in the ship. So it's quite a challenge. And my bosses said to me, well look, why don't you build something like this? They said it's got a black hull, a white superstructure, and red and black funnels. It's a liner. And I said, well, it may look like a liner, but it's not. And I said, I would have grave concerns if you forced me to build a ship like that. And I showed them what happened to an Italian liner, the Michelangelo, in April 1966. And here we see her. She's about 45,000 tons, so she's about the size of the Titanic, sailing across the Atlantic on her way to New York when she encountered a storm and a large wave. The wave then ran back towards the superstructure and ripped open the forward end of the superstructure, and some people were swept out and drowned. And that was my way of convincing my bosses that we didn't want that we wanted a proper liner, and that if we were to do it, we would have to pay for it. Now, I have a personal philosophy, and it's one that you may like to consider as well. And it says, before attempting anything new, you have the best chance of success if you have an appreciation for the past. What features on previous ships have worked? what have failed. You can only move forward with the new design if you have that appreciation. And I looked in great depth at many of the ships, both the transatlantic and other routes, to try and build into this new design features that I thought would be a big success. So what philosophies do you have? Do you think that's a good philosophy? What would you draw on if you were given that $1 billion? You've got to, it's a very, very important question. So engineers, who are we? What do we do? Well, engineers make the world go round, at least we think so. And that is a big responsibility. And certainly, as a naval architect, designing ships, the bottom line is the cargo and the people sailing on that ship are ultimately your responsibility. You've got to stand by the decisions you make. So as engineers, you've got to question, you've got to probe, and you really do need to think about it. So are you ready for that challenge? The grounding that you get here from Webb is probably better than any other grounding any other students of naval architecture can get. This place is absolutely special and unique. And you are very special people in having that and having that driving you in your careers. So from a single piece of paper, where I didn't use a computer, we hadn't a computer in the office to do computer drafting, so it had to be done on paper. This was the first design for Queen Mary 2. And it failed the test because it didn't generate enough revenue. And Mickey Harrison said to me, if you can't do better than this, Stephen, we'll just build cruise ships. So what did I have to do? Well, I hope we can see this. Yep, the main public rooms were below the lifeboats, like they are or were on QE2. So I decided to bring those public rooms down towards the bottom of the hull, above the waterline, make them very much higher than they would otherwise have been. We normally use about 3.5 meters, 3.8 meters for a public room deck. I decided to lift mine to 4.5 meters. So with the two decks, I had 9 meters of cushion. And so by then putting passenger cabins above the public room decks, I was able straight away to start having balcony cabins. And it's the balcony cabins that provide the premium that enabled me to get over all those constraints. Now, I didn't say, and I was very remiss not to say, that all those liner attributes compared to a cruise ship increased the price of the ship and the operation by 40%. So I had to, by design, build in an advantage of 40% in order for us to build the liner and not a cruise ship. And I took my design that took me 2 years to do, and the specification, took it to 5 European shipyards. In the event, we chose the French yard of Chantier de l'Atlantique at Saint-Nazaire, yard that built the Normandy, which you see here, which was the arch rival of the first Queen Mary, and they latterly built the last French flagship, the France. And these are the main particulars of the ship. 345 meters, the beam there, 41. The draft is important at 10 meters. It means you can come into Southampton and New York at any state of the tide. Very important. Displacement, around 75,000 tons. The air draft, we'll come to that in a moment. Bane of my life, the air draft. and you'll see why. 2 large diesel engines, 2 gas turbines, 120 megawatts of power are installed in Queen Mary 2. That's enough for the whole of the city of Southampton. But we need that power on occasion. Not all the time, but on occasion. 2,800 passengers, 1,300 crew, and gross tonnage. I hope you all know what gross tonnage is. It's a volumetric measure of tonnage. It's how we define the size of passenger ships. So three times the size of the Titanic, and basically twice the size of the earlier Queens. The reason the ship had to be big was to have the economy of scale, that the bigger you build a passenger ship, the cheaper each passenger bed becomes. And that was all part of getting over that 40% premium. So here we see the ship, what we envisaged. A good friend of mine, Gordon Bounds, painted this, and he supplied many of the artworks on Queen Mary 2. So we signed the contract on the 6th of November 2000. Little over a year afterwards, we started cutting steel, and this is the ceremony. And once the steel had started to be cut, we were then joining it into sections and panels and blocks. And by the 4th of July, which is an important date for 2 reasons, of course, it's your big day, but it's also the anniversary of Cunard's first ever sailing from Liverpool to Boston in 1840. So 5 months after we put the first 2 bits in the building dock, we were ready to float the ship, move her in a different position, and complete the process. And of course, these blocks, when we built Queen Mary 2, they were 600 tons apiece, 98 of them. Nowadays, the yard can cope with 1,200 tons. And of course, this is the process, the individual blocks. You have the brown, which is the machinery areas. The green are the crew areas and the first parts of the public rooms. The blue, passenger cabins. And there's about 3,500 people working on the ship, actually in the dock during this process, and 500 people working in the shipyard's drawing office, producing all the detailed plans. And then after moving the ship down the dock, we carry on. And what's amazing at that period was that the yard were building 5 other passenger ships at the same time. But surprise, surprise, everybody wanted to work on Queen Mary 2, to the point that all the other owners complained. So after the 98 blocks, here we are, we have Queen Mary 2. And we see her here in the big dock, building dock at Saint-Nazaire, with another section being ready to be lifted on board. Now, one of the great things that Carnival did for marine propulsion was they spearheaded the use of podded propulsion rather than using shaft lines. And 2 of the fantasy class, there were 8 fantasies, the last 2 were podded, and by merely taking off the shafts and putting 2 pods, we were able to judge how much better efficient the pods would be, and it was about 8-9% in efficiency without any optimization. And so naturally I chose to use pods on Queen Mary 2. So we have a forward-facing stainless steel propeller. The industry standard is to use nickel, aluminium, bronze, but I knew that as that propeller became eroded and the surface roughness increased, the efficiency of the propellers would drop quickly. And so by using stainless steel, I wanted to maintain that perfect finish and the efficiency. But the big amazing thing about these is that they weigh 320 tons apiece. And that's the weight of a 747 jumbo jet on takeoff. So we have 4 jumbo jets hanging at the aft end of Queen Mary 2. These forward ones are fixed, just provide forward and aft thrust, whereas these aft pair are on slip rings. And there's no umbilical cord to present the power to that motor or the control functions. It's all done through the slip ring. It's amazing technology that you too could be involved one day. But you notice this very curious and odd-shaped stern. Why did I do that? Well, one of my biggest concerns was the ship on the Atlantic pitching as she crossed the Atlantic in the swells, and having an enormous transom, there would have been a tremendous amount of sloshing and banging under the stern, which we get on the cruise ships. I didn't want that on Queen Mary 2, so I limited the transom to the amount needed really to mount the pods and to give us the hydrodynamic advantage that the transom gives us. But the aft end is a rounded cruiser stern, so if that stern dips into the swells, the energy is dissipated and you don't get any severe hammering noise at the stern. Developed by a naval architect in the 1960s called Costanzi. He built 2 ships, the Oceanic and the Eugenio Costa. Remember what I said? Looking at the past, deciding what would be relevant. That's one of the things here on Queen Mary 2. Now, the biggest problem for me was the funnel, because I would have dearly loved a much taller funnel, but I was constrained. Does anybody know what I was constrained with? Because it's your fault.
Airdraft?
Well, the air draft, but what is limiting my air draft? The Verrazano Narrows Bridge. That really, really did cause me trouble. So if you ever come to build a new one, please lift it up a bit. So the big problem, of course, is that this funnel isn't completely out of the area where the wind is turbulent and taking the smoke away. And so it's only by having these exaggerated skirts around the base of the funnel throwing air up that it helps the smoke disperse. And even at the back of the funnel, on top of the gas turbine house, we have this strange railing. And this railing with these close space bars slows the air down at the back of the funnel, causing it to bunch up, and it creates a cushion so that the smoke doesn't drop down at the aft end of the ship. And of course here we have Verrazano Narrows Bridge. This is where it's low tide. At high tide, there is 9 feet clearance. And that's at the high point of the bridge. And the New York Times asked me, they said, what would have happened if you'd got your calculations wrong? Well, it would only been a problem the first time. So here's the funnel. We can see the wind scoop or skirt. And the whistles, one of them comes from the Queen Mary in Long Beach, California, reconditioned so that it runs on compressed air. And we had a replica made, all done by the company that made them in the early 1930s, Kockums in Sweden. Now, as naval architects, it's a lot of theory. I wouldn't say it's really dull at all, but it's nice to have a little bit of fun at times. And here we see the mast of the ship. We're at anchor in a Norwegian field, and we see the Norwegian flag is rather limp and rather sorry for itself. The Cunard house flag on this particular instant is fluttering and is seen. But what you see here is what we call the red duster, the red ensign denoting that this is a British ship. And I saw Queen Mary II as the flagship of the British Merchant Marine, and there was no way I was going to allow the red duster to end up like this at any moment in time. And so the air conditioning exhaust comes out. Simple but effective. And it's the sort of things that you can all do throughout your career. And another thing, somebody quite recently said to me, what was you smoking when you designed these slots? Because they're all different sizes at the top of those windscreens. Well, I have to admit, I didn't design them, the shipyard did. But each one of these slots changes the frequency of vibration of these screens so that the vibratory energy from the pods below do not make these screens vibrate at all. QE2, her screens were dancing around, and many of the cruise ships, you see them dancing, but they don't dance about on Queen Mary II. So, looking down at the ship, during construction we have the breakwater from the Normandy, the forward face of the superstructure. Two things drove me to design it in that way. One was to replicate partially the first Queen Mary, but also thinking about that time at Bournemouth when I was on holiday as a kid, when we went to QE2 for that day. But I used to build sandcastles on the beach, and as the tide would come in and demolish the sandcastle, as the sandcastle collapsed, invariably it would produce that conical shape. So I thought it rather nice to incorporate that into the front of Queen Mary II. So we've said what the differences are between a liner and a cruise ship. Let's now actually look at the difference. There's no other passenger ship in the world, Hampton, take note, that has a bow like that. And that's to enable the ship to cut through those storms like we had this week. And that's a cruise ship. You cannot drive a cruise ship in rough weather at speed like we were travelling. You have to divert or slow down. And that's the whole basis of this ship, Queen Mary II. And for me, the challenge was to give a first-class experience and the style of the great ships of state of the 1930s. But on those ships, it was only the first class that experienced it. I wanted everybody on Queen Mary II to be exposed to the grandeur of those ships of state. And so, even if you book the most lowly cabin, this is the restaurant that you eat in. It's by far the most magnificent restaurant, I believe, on a transatlantic liner. And although I didn't do the decoration, I did provide the interior architects with the space and the dome so they could decorate it in that fashion. And we have various signature rooms throughout the ship. The observation lounge, and of course many cruise ships have continuous glazing, but we have discrete windows. And I'm going to tell you a story here. The British Coast Guard wanted me to put storm shutters on all of these forward-facing windows. And we said to them, the size of the storm shutters, you wouldn't be able to carry them. It would need an army of people to lift them, or we'd have to put them on by crane. Absolute nonsense. And the way we got round that was by using the equivalence rule within SOLAS. And so we have the glazing is multiple sheets where the combined strength is more than if we had the storm shutter there and the normal level of protection from the glass. So it's things like that that all of you are going to have to do. You're going to have to find solutions to problems such as that, because if I'd have had those storm shutters on, it would have ruined that room and many of the others. Thinking out of the box, rising to the challenge. Another great room, the chart room and the lobby on board and the planetarium. First ship to have a large planetarium where the red seats, you can watch the planetarium show. Largest ballroom afloat, and a show lounge when it was first built had more show equipment than West End and New York stages. Absolute tremendous amount, $15 million worth of equipment in there. And here we see a nice comparison. We see Britannia, Cunard's first ship that took a little over 2 weeks to cross the Atlantic, small paddle steamer, 4th of July, 1840. The three-funnelled Queen Mary in Long Beach, the QE2 in red, and of course Queen Mary 2 behind, and 38 double-decker buses ranged along the base. So we had 2 sets of sea trials, which is normal for a passenger ship. The first is to allow the yard to set everything up. We found that the ship behaved magnificently, propulsion system worked well, and we got a reasonable turn of speed, but the hull was still dirty. Here we see the ship slewing round. When you use the pods to turn, the angle of heel is much reduced. The ship actually slews around. Speed drops off very quickly. And then we came in, everything was painted, and we went out again, and we achieved, in the middle of the night, 29.62 knots. So she was 0.3 of a knot above the contract speed, which doesn't sound very much, but the power that that represents at nearly 30 knots is enormous. So she did extremely well. Delivery took place towards the end of December, and the French were so pleased they sent over their air acrobatic team. And then there was 2 sets of maiden voyages. There was a cruise to the Caribbean, which I was lucky to be invited on. And then the first transatlantic didn't happen until April to enable the ship to settle in and Cunard to get used to operating such a big ship. But Cunard always worried about the ship because she has to leave Southampton at 7 in the morning, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She arrives in New York 6, 7 o'clock, and then she's sailing again around 4, 5 o'clock. So she's probably just leaving now. And they were worried that if she was ever held up on the Atlantic, it could throw a whole season's of voyages out with people having to rebook flights and everything. So we spent over $1 million of the shipyard's money on model tests. Now you think this is over 20 years ago. You probably do a lot more on computers now. Believe me, that's no fun. Playing about with models is fun. And so we took all the data from the model tests and combined it with satellite data for 30 years, and we set the ship going backwards and forwards, and I'd like to play this. It's only a short bit, and of course you see here the ship's speed affected by the weather, so it's an involuntary speed loss, and you see the wave height, and these are the dates from the satellite data. So now, concentrate on the next one, I think. wallop. So what's that saying is that in that extreme storm that occurred in February 1995, with Queen Mary II sailing across, with all the power of Southampton inside the ship, the Atlantic can still bring her to a stop. Awesome. That is what, as a naval architect, you've got to think about. How is your ship going to react in the environment that it's designed for? My ship has to cope with that. And we determine from that simulation that with the margins of power and everything, if everything was running, and that's an important proviso, if everything's running, the ship would never be late over that 30-year period of weather it encountered. And on that maiden transatlantic, would you believe, wallop, she encountered a huge storm. Commodore Warwick, her first master, called me up and he said, "Stephen, we're having so much bad weather, the worst we've ever had. Should I continue? I've got to get to New York on time." And he said, "I'm really worried." And I said, "Look, Ron, it's what the ship's designed to do. Just go for it." And he said, "It's all very well you saying that, you're sat in London." But of course he did. And they were able to arrive in New York to meet up with QE2 that you see here. And you remember at the beginning where everybody said there wouldn't be another transatlantic liner, the QE2 was going to be the last? Well, I say to youngsters, from watching that Blue Peter program in 1965, and with the help of my colleagues at Cunard and the shipyard, we've rewritten history, because there, against all the odds, is another transatlantic liner that is doing exceptionally well even after 20 years. Now, as you can imagine, I'm immensely proud of Queen Mary II, immensely proud of her and everybody who helped build her. But of course it's Justin Johnson, that's physics master, that helped me as a school kid change, or a university student I must say, change from doing chemistry to the naval architecture. And I kept in touch with Justin, and he sailed on the Cunard ships giving computer lessons, but sadly he died 2 months before the ship was delivered, so he never did get to see the ship. And so I've written a eulogy that basically says the ship only exists because of what Justin did for me, a teacher and his former pupil. And that eulogy is hidden on board the ship. And the idea is that, or I like to think, that Justin's actually perpetually sailing around on board Queen Mary II. And of course, when the ship comes to be dismantled sometime way in the future, my hope is that that will be found and the story about Justin will come to the fore. It's a very important thing for me to have that. Now, Blue Peter, would you believe, came on board. And they said, we've looked back at our records, we perhaps weren't as supportive as we should have been, and so now we're going to give you our gold badge. And they told me I was the oldest person to receive the badge apart from Her Majesty the Queen. And even though the influence of Blue Peter is much reduced, taking that badge into schools, you really do capture the imagination of the youngsters. So what's Queen Mary II done? We've just celebrated the 400th transatlantic. I was on that a few weeks ago. She's been up to Long Beach and bizarrely exchanged salutes using Queen Mary's original funnel, or whistle rather, with the Queen Mary. So that's to be repeated in 2026 when Queen Mary will go through Panama Canal for the first time. Now, I'm often asked, what would I do different? And I tell you something now, free of charge, is that there's no such thing as a perfect ship. A ship is a compromise between disparate requirements. And it's your skill as a naval architect to define how that is going to be addressed and what's ultimately important. It's your call. You're going to be responsible. So on my ship, the observation lookout below the mast, you couldn't see the bow, which I rather thought was important, so I would change that. Obviously, the gas turbines, when we decided to put those in the ships, the fuel has gone up in price and we've got to really think about green issues. Again, something you're all going to have to do. But the one thing that I often have a laugh about is that of all the people on the ship, the one person that would always needle me all the time was the captain, who said his cabin was too small. So again, you have to pander to certain people like the captain. But Kevin Opray, who was my good friend, who said that, I said to him, look, Kevin, I've given you the best balcony on the whole ship. So one other thing, as naval architects, you've got to be really focused. And that's the people who go work on your ships, the crew. And on Queen Mary 2, I was mindful that the transatlantic route meant that the crew barely get time off. They can't go ashore in New York or Southampton because it's their busiest days. So I did a number of things. Every crew cabin on the Queen Mary 2, and there's nearly 800 of them, have all got en-suite facilities. The other ships you either share or it's collective facilities down the hall. They have a large suite of learning rooms, recreation rooms and the like, far and above of what is normal on a cruise ship, because I wanted to ensure that the crew would be loyal and stay with the ship. Something you must think about as well. And throughout the building process, you've got to have a team spirit, you've got to have respect, as well as your own ambition. And it's how you work through that ambition, working with your team, that will define how you will be as a naval architect. Because you're not only going to be designing, you're going to be managing people. And you've got to have people on side. They've got to think the same way as you. And you've got to be able to trust people. And you only do that by working together. And certainly it's your responsibility to foster all those attributes. Now, another thing that's really important is acknowledging support. And I've already mentioned Justin and what I've done there, but several other people have helped me throughout my career. People that I never knew suddenly were very keen to help me, nominating me for various awards and the like. Sir Robert Easton, Marshall Meek and Jeff Kirk, and even Prince Philip. He became very interested in Queen Mary 2, and I became good friends with him to the point where he would always ask me to show him around Queen Mary 2 and the like. And it's very important, and you, as students of Webb, must know that more than anything else. You've been given this tremendous advantage, so you've got to put something back. And we all have a role to play in encouraging youngsters to achieve great things. And certainly I've done things like future engineers, mentoring youngsters and the like, and it's very, very important to do that. Now, what I would say as well, we're going to talk very quickly in the final few bits about mental health, because your career is not always going to go the way you want. You're going to run into problems, and I did when I was 50. I was let go from Carnival. Huge problem for me, but formed a consultancy with a group of colleagues that then ran into difficulty, and that was a severe knock to my confidence, leading to quite a lot of depression. And I was able to get over that depression with reference to somebody else that I suddenly discovered and looked up to. And this was a young rugby player in Ireland who really, very much like me, at an early age, wanted to be the best rugby player in Ireland. And he worked tirelessly and became a rugby international for Ireland. But sadly, when he came back from one tour abroad, having a party, somebody gate crashed that party, and then he was accused of rape. Subsequently, the court case threw it out unanimously, but he had that stigma of that rape charge. And so I say to you that you've got to be so careful in what you do. But the inspiration I got from this young man, Paddy Jackson, was that he picked himself up and continued with his career. And in fact, I've met Paddy a number of times, and he's a tremendous guy. And I know that his example has certainly helped me a lot. And you as engineers, will you have that conviction to stand up for somebody like Paddy? Things that might be controversial. To be an effective engineer, you've got to challenge everything. The press were all over this guy, saying that he was not worth considering. But when you delve into all the newspapers and everything else, you find that things that were attributed to him actually never happened. And it's only as critical engineers like you must really delve into everything. You can only be effective if you do that. So drill down, be a team player, be kind and considerate, and have that ambition. All of you here must have that ambition. Certainly I did, and that's Queen Mary too. Now, of course, you could say, well, what am I doing now? Well, I have a new baby that I'm developing, new national flagship. There was a proposal for this to represent the UK developing trade, and I said to a local paper that it looked like a fishing trawler. And so that was thrown out, and there was a national competition, and we came up with that, and I've been working on that, even putting sails on it and the like. Multi-use spaces, cabins, of course. And the idea is, I'm taking that design and trying to get a commercial operation to actually fund and build that. And that's what I'm working on at the moment. That's my next ambition. So hopefully next time I come to Webb, I can tell you that I'm actually fully involved, and that is now happening. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've spoken a lot, but the fundamental thing, and the thing I believe more than anything else, and perhaps I'm a little bit biased, is that Queen Mary 2 is the greatest ship in the world. So thank you all very much.
your dinner's not too far away, but Dr. Payne, stay in, answer questions. We're going to give students priority, but then anyone can answer for a while. Right?
Come on, Hampton.
Questions?
Has anybody been on Queen Mary 2? Did she meet your expectations?
I suppose
so. So Hampton, what would you have done different?
very little.
There's a question over here.
Okay.
It's a great ship.
Okay. Thank you. So
In your presentation, you said that interest in ocean liners really came back due to the movie Titanic, right? What is the market today like for people who do ride on Queen Mary 2?
well, the ship's full.
Yeah.
It's full all the time, and certainly the fares in the premium cabins are extremely high, but she's full up the whole time.
So, would you consider riding Queen Mary 2? It's kind of cheesy, but it's more about the journey than the destination.
Most people actually go on Queen Mary 2 because the ship is the destination. She offers that. And a lot of the pricing is comparable to if you travel first class by air, you can go Queen's Grill, which is the top where you get really pampered and everything. Business class is like Princess Grill, which is one step low. And then the vast majority of people are Britannia, but it's still a very high standard, as I think you would attest.
I got off of her this morning at 7 a.m. doing a crossing. And if you're going to say Britannia is like economy in an airplane, it's nicer than that. It's quite nice.
Any other question? Yes.
The ship is now, she's like 22, 23 years old. What are the plans in the future to keep her active, or will there be liner issues near the end of her life?
Well, she was the first ship that we at Carnival, one of my ideas was to impose a fatigue life on the ship for the structure. And I worked very closely with Lloyd's Register before we placed the contract to define what that fatigue life should be and what was needed to be done. And I set it at 40 years. So the idea is that structurally, she shouldn't need major structural repairs for 40 years. QE2, as soon as she entered service, and she was a steel hull and aluminium superstructure, within the first year, she was requiring major interventions because of the aluminium cracking and the like. But so far, Queen Mary 2 has not required anything of that. And the thing that's going to really define the length of service of the ship isn't going to be the structure. It's all the pipe work and systems on board that degrade over time. And you certainly find it more and more difficult to get spare parts for all the critical pieces of equipment like the air conditioning that, you know, you just can't allow the toilets not to work or the air conditioning not to work. So it's when that gets difficult, you have to make the decision. And with QE2, it was when she was almost 39 years old. But certainly Queen Mary 2, she's had a reasonable refit this year. But in 27 and 29, she's going to have significant refits that are going to keep her progressive and keep her in service.
Other questions?
For the funnel design, did any pre-existing ships inform that decision to design?
On what aspect, sorry?
For the funnel design?
For the funnel. Well, it's QE2 has it, but her funnel is almost twice as high. And the wind scoop on QE2 is very, very small compared to what we have. And that I had to raise the wind scoop bit by bit until we found a position where it was being effective. But it comes from QE2 originally, yeah. Keith.
Yeah, Stephen, I see you brought it in under $1 billion, you built a quality ship. Did Cunard get its 10-year return? And if they did, why haven't they built more ships? Why is it continuing to the last transatlantic?
Well,
Oh.
let's not go so far as to say last. There's still time.
But the last to date.
The last to date. Well, the shipyard proposed to Carnival and Cunard a second ship that would be a slightly simplified and cheaper version. But Mickey Harrison certainly felt that the real selling point of the ship was it was a single unit, it was the icon, and by having a second one, he thought that it would dilute that. So that's the main reason. Yes.
Are there any other passenger ships out there that you admire?
Oh.
Yesterday, go back yesterday.
Well, the QE2 was a great ship, although they tell me compared to Queen Mary II, she was a cocktail shaker because she danced around about twice as much as Queen Mary II does. Rotterdam, of course, the Holland America flagship that's now a museum. And in fact, a few weeks ago, I presented a conference on Rotterdam about ocean liner design. So we had great fun for 2 days talking about ocean liner design. But a lot of the modern ships don't do it for me, as you can imagine. But there are a few. There's the MSC company that for its regular cruise line, mass market cruise line, the ships are like any other big, bold monolith. But they've got another brand, Explorer brand, which look like big yachts. And I'm certainly very keen to have a look at them because they look quite nice. But it depends what you're going to use it for. As I say, the Atlantic with Queen Mary II is very, very special.
We have time for one last question.
Yep.
Are the two gas turbines used to achieve the normal service speed, or are they for like a higher sprint speed?
Yeah, the original game plan was to run the ship at 26.5 knots on a 6-day transatlantic schedule. And for that, we needed 4 diesel engines and 1 gas turbine. So we would have 1 turbine as spare. Of course, regularly, those diesel engines need a maintenance cycle. And so if one of the 4 diesels was out, we would then have to engage the second gas turbine. Because of the price of fuel and the need due to environmental regulations to cut down on emissions, we've gone from a 6-day crossing to a 7-day crossing. And with that, invariably, we just need the 4 diesels, and that will give us a speed of about 22, 23 knots. Again, if there's maintenance required, we need one of the turbines. So that's still there. And the decision to put the turbines in originally was to free up a lot of space inside the ship where we wouldn't need another funnel trunk. And we were able to put a lot more cabins in the ship, and it greatly gave me more space within the public rooms, which I was really struggling with another uptake. So it solved that problem. As I say, there's no such thing as a perfect ship. You've really got to work at all these things. And the turbines was a way out, a compromise.
Would you consider any alternative fuels if you were redesigning it again?
Yes, the national flagship that we did with Harland and Wolff, we designed her to run on methanol. And certainly Maersk Container Line are beginning to use methanol for their ships. So that's what we designed it on, with diesel as well, obviously, because if she was going around the world, there may be places where we wouldn't get the methanol, so you needed a backup. But methanol, there's a big push towards LNG, but I don't see that as the golden bullet, because it's still throwing carbon into the atmosphere. So you've got to get away from that. The methanol, you're taking carbon from the atmosphere, making methanol, and then you put the carbon back, and it's just recycling the carbon. If we can do that cheaply enough, then that will be... Ammonia, of course, is another thing that people are looking at. Obviously, it's nasty stuff to have on ships, but it may be a solution. And also, I must say as well, I'm looking at the Rolls-Royce nuclear reactor as a possible future. I led a study at the Royal Academy of Engineering a few years ago where we looked into nuclear propulsion, and we deemed that everything technically was there ready. After all, you had the Savannah, the Germans had the Otto Hahn in the 50s and 60s, but it's public perception, and for instance, the Port of Southampton has declared itself a nuclear-free zone. So you have difficulty taking a nuclear ship in at the present time, and that's why the Royal Navy every now and again decides to take a nuclear submarine into Southampton just to say, we can do that.
We should wrap it up.
Yep, sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.